revelation that unfolded not over months of careful investigation, but in 72 hours. 72 hours that shattered the illusion of diplomatic progress. 72 hours that exposed a covert network spanning 11 European nations. 72 hours that brought the United Nations Security Council to the brink of complete collapse. What Vladimir Putin orchestrated this week crossed a line that NATO planners had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, Volodymyr Zelensky did not hesitate. He responded with precision, with fury, and with a strategic clarity that caught even Moscow off guard. The sleeper army that Western analysts had long theorized about is no longer theoretical, is awake, is active, and it has already begun to move. For 18 months now, there had been whispers, not from official intelligence briefings, not from formal diplomatic channels, just whispers, that the Kremlin was preparing something unprecedented. Putin has been aggressive, yes, but he's been calculatingly methodical in his aggression. His moves have followed a certain rhythm, a predictability, almost a choreography that Western analysts had learned to anticipate. But what set off alarm bells in Langley and Brussels this January was that the rhythm went silent. Intelligence officers who monitor Russian military communications know the indicators, the encrypted traffic between Moscow and regional commanders, the unusual financial transfers through shell corporations in Cyprus and Dubai, the repositioning of GRU operatives across Eastern European capitals, the sudden recall of diplomatic staff from non-essential postings. All of that went quiet. And whenever Putin goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. For weeks, NATO's intelligence sharing networks had been tracking anomalies. Small things at first, a retired military officer in Poland suddenly receiving large wire transfers, a network of rental properties in Germany purchased through untraceable LLCs, communications equipment being smuggled through Belarus in shipments labeled as agricultural machinery. Individually, these data points meant little. Together, they painted a picture that no one wanted to see. Russia had been building something in the shadows, not a conventional force, not a cyber operation, something older, something more insidious, a sleeper army. Early Tuesday morning, signals intelligence units operating out of Fort Meade detected what they described as a coordinated activation sequence, including burst transmissions that had not been observed in over 30 years. These are the kinds of Cold War-era communication protocols that Russia only uses when they are signaling something very specific: imminent action, plausible deniability, or strategic misdirection. Analysts didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Putin was changing his operational posture. And when an adversary of Russia's capabilities shifts posture without explanation, even by the smallest measure, every Western capital pays attention. By Wednesday morning, the picture had become clearer and more terrifying. Intelligence services across Europe began reporting a synchronized pattern of activity. In Poland, a former Russian military contractor who had been living quietly in Warsaw for 6 years suddenly disappeared, leaving behind a cache of weapons in a rented storage unit. In Germany, 3 individuals with suspected ties to Russian intelligence were observed conducting counter-surveillance near critical infrastructure sites. In the Baltic states, power grid operators reported attempted intrusions that bore the hallmarks of GRU cyber units, but with physical components that suggested on-the-ground coordination. The sleeper cells weren't just waking up, they were synchronizing. The emergency session convened by the United Nations Security Council Thursday evening was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Diplomat after diplomat, briefing after briefing, described Putin's move as unprecedented, destabilizing, and perhaps most importantly, a direct violation of every assurance Russia had given about non-interference in European internal security. But strategic ambiguity only works if the target hesitates. Zelensky did not. In fact, Ukraine's response over the following hours was among the most aggressive and coordinated we've seen since the war began. Here's what we know. Within 4 hours of the Security Council briefing, Ukraine launched a series of deep strikes into Russian-occupied territory that caught Moscow completely off guard. These weren't the routine drone operations we've grown accustomed to. These were precision strikes using advanced Western munitions, weapon systems that Ukraine only deploys when they are preparing to fundamentally reshape the battlefield. Simultaneously, Ukrainian Special Operations Forces conducted raids on suspected Russian intelligence safe houses in territories recently liberated from occupation. What they found confirmed the worst fears of Western intelligence: detailed maps of European infrastructure, communication equipment linked to the activated sleeper networks, and documentation suggesting the operation had been years in the making. Tonight, Pentagon sources confirmed that Ukraine launched coordinated strikes on 47 targets across occupied Crimea and the Donbass region, including a command center in Sevastopol that had recently been reinforced for what analysts believe was the coordination of the sleeper operation. Ukraine struck before Russia could disperse their command elements. They hit the communication arrays, they hit the logistics hubs that had been funneling equipment to the covert networks. They hit the transportation nodes that were likely preparing to move operatives deeper into Europe. In other words, Ukraine targeted the nervous system of the sleeper operation, the infrastructure that would have made it fully operational. This is what made the Security Council's warning so urgent. Putin's activation wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of hybrid warfare escalation that could destabilize NATO's eastern flank if left unchecked. And Zelensky, understanding that fully, responded with overwhelming force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't strike civilian areas. They didn't escalate beyond what was militarily necessary. They hit command nodes. They hit the enablers. They hit the very architecture that Moscow had spent years building in the shadows. Intelligence officials speaking to Western media described the Ukrainian operation as surgically devastating, a phrase that captures both its precision and its impact. Within hours, the Russian coordination network had been severely degraded. And here's where the story becomes even more consequential. Western intelligence officials now believe that Putin's sleeper activation was designed to test the cohesion of NATO after months of political uncertainty in Washington and growing fatigue in European capitals. Putin wanted to see whether the alliance would fracture under the pressure of simultaneous internal threats, but instead the opposite happened. Zelensky didn't wait for NATO consensus. He launched a response that was so immediate, so devastating, that even the Kremlin noticed. You don't get Vladimir Putin's attention easily, but today Ukraine did. Senior analysts speaking with Reuters under anonymity described Putin's gambit as strategic probing, a way to identify weaknesses in Western resolve before committing to larger operations. But Zelensky proved today that Ukraine remains both capable and unpredictable. Their strikes were not only precise, they were timed so perfectly that Russian air defense systems in Crimea were overwhelmed before they could fully activate. That timing matters because it shows Ukraine has intelligence penetration deep within Russian operational planning. It shows that Kyiv is not a passive defender waiting to react. They are an active participant in shaping the battlefield, and that reality has fundamentally changed Moscow's calculations. For the first time since the full-scale invasion began, there are credible reports that Russian commanders are questioning the security of their own communication networks. If Ukraine could anticipate and strike the sleeper coordination centers with such accuracy, what else do they know? That uncertainty is now rippling through Russian command structures. As reports continued coming in throughout Friday, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's response. Ukrainian Air Force units carried out long-range strikes using Storm Shadow missiles, forcing Russian air defense units to reposition from the front lines. Ukrainian naval drones targeted a Russian intelligence vessel in the Black Sea that had been actively communicating with the sleeper networks in the last 72 hours. Ukrainian cyber units operating in coordination with Western partners reportedly disrupted the encrypted channels being used by Russian operatives to receive instructions from Moscow. This wasn't just retaliation, this wasn't just defense, this was strategic dismantlement. This was systemic degradation of Russian hybrid capabilities. And systemic degradation is the one thing Putin has struggled to counter since the war began. For every advance Russia has made on the ground, Ukraine has countered with something that complicates Moscow's ability to exploit that advance. The sleeper army was supposed to open a new front, one inside Europe itself. Instead, it has become another example of Russian overreach meeting Ukrainian adaptability. Remember, Putin thought the West would be too divided to respond effectively. He thought European capitals would be too focused on their own internal politics to coordinate. He thought Washington would be too paralyzed by its own transitions to provide meaningful support. He thought the sleeper activation would create chaos, and that chaos would create opportunity. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. NATO is more unified than it has been in months. European intelligence services are sharing information at unprecedented levels. Washington has already signaled that additional military assistance packages are being fast-tracked. The very crisis Putin engineered to fracture the alliance has instead galvanized it. What makes this moment so dangerous and so revealing is that Putin's sleeper activation happened at a time when he is under extraordinary domestic pressure. Military hardliners want escalation and total commitment to territorial conquest. Economic pragmatists want a negotiated settlement that will ease sanctions. Security services want expanded budgets and operational freedom. Nationalist factions want visible victories they can broadcast to the Russian public. Putin is balancing these demands while managing a war that has already cost Russia over 400,000 casualties. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength, they're doing it from pressure, they're doing it from vulnerability. The sleeper activation was meant to demonstrate that Russia still has cards to play, that even if the conventional war has stalled, Moscow can threaten Europe in other ways. But today, that card was exposed and neutralized before it could be fully played. The Security Council's emergency resolution, now being circulated among member states, was designed to signal that the international community is not willing to tolerate covert destabilization operations inside sovereign nations. Western officials said plainly that Russia's activation of sleeper networks was inconsistent with even the most basic norms of international conduct, that is, diplomatic language for this is an act of war by other means. You don't usually hear that tone from the United Nations unless something serious is at stake. More significantly, the resolution includes provisions for expanded intelligence sharing among member states and a formal investigation into the extent of Russian infiltration operations. Russia predictably vetoed the resolution, but the veto itself created further isolation. China abstained, a notable departure from their usual alignment with Moscow. India expressed deep concern. Even nations that have historically maintained neutrality found themselves unable to defend the indefensible. The Security Council didn't just experience tension today, it imploded under the weight of what Putin had unleashed. Meanwhile, Zelensky addressed the Ukrainian people in a defiant, resolute speech Friday night. He said, "They thought they could fight us in the shadows. They thought they could hide their aggression behind plausible deniability, but we see them. We have always seen them, and tonight they learned that shadows are not armor." He said, "Every nation in Europe that wondered whether this war affects them now has their answer. The sleeper cells were not meant for Ukraine, they were meant for you, and we are the ones who stopped them." And he said, "We are not just defending our borders, we are defending the very idea that sovereign nations cannot be destabilized from within by hostile powers. That fight belongs to all of us." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a wartime leader who understands just how high the stakes have become. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Putin's sleeper activation wasn't isolated. Along with the covert network mobilization, Belarusian military forces also increased their presence along the Polish border, conducting exercises that NATO describes as provocative. Russian naval assets in the Baltic Sea have repositioned to locations that would allow them to threaten undersea communication cables. Cyber attacks targeting European financial systems increased by 300% in the same 72-hour window. All of this happened within the same time frame as the sleeper activation. When Putin moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. Whether this represents the beginning of a new phase in the conflict or a desperate gambit by a leader running out of options remains to be seen. But the coordination suggests planning, and planning suggests intention. Intelligence analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Putin is preparing for a spring offensive that the sleeper networks were meant to support by creating chaos behind NATO lines. Another is that Putin is attempting to create leverage for negotiations by demonstrating that Russia can threaten Europe without firing a single conventional shot. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Putin is attempting to trigger Article 5 through deniable means, hoping that a fractured NATO response would expose the alliance's limitations. But today, Ukraine took that card off the table. They didn't wait for consensus. They didn't defer to diplomatic process. They didn't allow Moscow to set the tempo. They struck fast, hard, and with devastating effectiveness. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Putin wants to see whether the West will sustain its support through this new phase of hybrid escalation. Zelensky wants to show that Ukraine can fight on multiple fronts simultaneously. NATO wants to prevent the conflict from spilling beyond Ukraine's borders. And the international community wants to prevent a precedent where covert destabilization operations become normalized. The outcome of this test will shape not just the trajectory of this war, but the security architecture of Europe for decades to come. Tonight, we've heard from defense officials who are now monitoring Russian command communications for signs of Moscow's next move. They say Russian military leadership is in damage control mode, attempting to assess how severely their covert networks have been compromised. They say there are indications that some sleeper operatives have gone dark, either neutralized by European security services or abandoning their positions out of fear of exposure. And they say Putin's decision to activate the networks prematurely is likely part of a broader desperation strategy intended to change the narrative before spring arrives. But Ukraine is not backing down. In fact, Ukraine is doubling down. Their response today, swift, precise, and overwhelming, sent a message to Putin that the shadows are no longer safe. And it sent a message to NATO that Ukraine remains the most effective barrier against Russian aggression. As the weekend unfolds, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Putin hoped to achieve with this activation. But what we do know is that the international community's response was timely. It exposed the operation before it could reach full effectiveness. It unified allies who had been drifting toward fatigue, and it demonstrated that covert aggression will be met with overt consequences. What happens next will depend on what Putin does in the coming days. If he escalates further, this moment will be remembered as the beginning of a new and more dangerous phase. If he retreats to reassess, Ukraine and NATO have already shown they are prepared. They have shown they are watching. They have shown they are ready to respond. And tonight, for the first time in months, Moscow appears to be genuinely uncertain. The Kremlin is quiet, too quiet. And when Putin is quiet, it means he is calculating. It means he is choosing his next move carefully. Because tonight, Vladimir Putin learned something he has learned many times before, but never quite this painfully, that underestimating Ukraine is always a mistake, that the West, for all its dysfunction, can still coordinate when it matters, and that shadows make poor armor when your enemy can see in the dark. This story is far from over, but tonight one thing is clear: the sleeper army has been awakened and immediately wounded. The Security Council may have imploded, but it imploded around Russia's isolation, and Volodymyr Zelensky has once again proven that in this war, initiative matters more than intimidation, and we will be here watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.